Hello and welcome. In this video series, I'm going to cover how to make a basic top-down shooter inside of Unity using Playmaker visual scripting. I assume that you already have at least a simple understanding of the Unity interface and have Playmaker installed in your project as well if you're going to be following along. With that being said, I'm going to kick the first movie off with just making our basic ship module itself. Obviously, we could import a mesh or model a ship if we'd like, but I'm going to make mine with Unity primitives just to keep it simple. The first thing I'm going to do is in my hierarchy just right click and create an empty game object. And notice it didn't come in at 0. Sometimes they don't. So at the top of the transform, I'm going to click the cog and just click reset. It's always a good idea to build at 0. And because this game object is going to become the container for my entire ship module, I want to make sure that I have predictable values, and I want to keep this local space and this global space aligned. So with that being said, I also want to name this something that makes sense. So I'm going to call this my player ship. And while I'm here, I'm also going to tag this as my player because likely later down the road we're going to need to be able to steal information off this object. Then I'm going to select the object, right click on it, and make another empty. And this will put the object inside of the first object as a child. And the other thing it does is since my player ship group was zeroed out, my new object will also be zeroed out. It's just a quick trick. I'm going to dupe this object too, and we're going to use it for a couple things. The first one I'm going to call mesh group, and this is the one I'm going to use to put all my primitive shapes inside of just to keep them nice and tidy. And this next one I'm going to call my weapons group, and this is going to become the container for little modules down the road that we could switch to and from, maybe upgrades of weapons and so forth. The meshes group, now I'm going to select, right click on it, and we're going to throw a capsule in here. And the capsule is going to become the body of my ship. And I want to lay it down in the world since I'm going to have my game looking straight down on it. So in my transform, I'm going to take my X rotation and set it to 90. And right now, if you're looking at your game view, you're going to notice that we're now looking at the end of the capsule. And the reason is we need to take our camera and set it up so that we can actually preview our game correctly. This means two things. First off, in my game view, I need to pick a aspect ratio to build to. Currently mine's set to 16:9. But if I pick a different size, you'll notice that the aspect ratio changes. And it doesn't necessarily matter what size you want to make it, but you just need to be aware of this and get it set before you start adding in your UI and other elements of the game. So I'm going to set mine back to 16:9, and then I'm going to select the camera and take it back to 0 on the Z so that it's at the center of the world. And then I'm also going to rotate the X value by 90, and what this will do is make the camera look straight down. And then I'll set the Y value to about 20. This will move the camera up in space so that it's looking down onto the capsule object that I'm going to use for my ship. At this point, we need to make a decision about our main camera. First off is, do I want to leave it as perspective or orthographic? Perspective is going to make the ship look further left or further right. It's going to make it almost look like it's leaning a little bit in space as it moves to the edges of the scene. In my game, I'm going to set it to orthographic. And if you do that, you'll notice that the image size changed all of a sudden, and the preview of our camera turns into a long column. This is because distance of the camera, how close or how far away it is, doesn't matter anymore. It sees the object exactly for what it is. So in order to change what we see out here in our game view, we need to first make sure we're zoomed all the way out, that we don't have our mouse wheel zoomed in, and then take our main camera, and in the camera component, take the size property and set this up to maybe something like 10. We can always come back and revisit this later if we don't like it, but for right now I'll leave it at this value. Alright, so our camera is set up so that we can see our little capsule mesh, and this will make it easier to tell what direction I'm building to. I would like to keep the forward direction of my ship in positive Z. This will make aiming it and doing some other things with it later a little more simple. And so in order to keep my ship in the scene view, looking as if it is flying in positive Z, I'm going to build the tail on this side of it. And I'm going to do that by just creating a cube in my mesh group and scaling this thing down to a thinner object, and then I'll rotate it and position it off in space so that it sort of looks like a fin. Something like that. Now I have just a direction assumed by the direction of that arrow. So in order to make the other side, I'm going to Control D, duplicate this thing, and then switch the X transform position and invert the Y rotation to -35. And that will produce the other side of the fin. And just for fun, I'll throw in one more capsule object that I've scaled down to maybe something like 0.3, and I'll make it a little shorter. We'll lift it up away from my ship, and maybe I'll move it backwards a little bit so it kind of becomes another tail fin, and I'll just use some materials to make that stand out. It makes my shape a little more interesting. So now my mesh group contains these 4 objects, and we can move the whole entire thing around with this player ship group, and it will act as one unit. We need to make a decision at this point. Each of these primitive objects that we made has a collider on it. The capsule has a capsule collider, and these cubes have box colliders and so forth. And we could use these to decide if the ship has been struck by an enemy or a projectile or something like that. Or we could also simplify this and just break it down to one kind of primitive capsule collider or something. And that's what I'm going to do in this case. So I'm going to take each of these objects and remove their component collider by right-clicking on their box collider or their capsule collider or whatever, and just removing the component. Now they're just a mesh renderer of a shape, and we'll come back and visit the collider setup here in just a second. The next thing I'm going to do is just give my ship a little bit of design by throwing some simple materials on it. And in my assets folder, I don't have a materials folder yet, so I'm going to create a materials folder. And then inside of it, oops, let me go back. Inside of it, I'm going to create a material, and I'll call this first one blue material, and then I'll duplicate it a few times, and I'll make a, maybe let's make a light blue emissive as well, and I'll make a dark gray or something along those lines. You could make whatever material you would like. Alright, in order to tweak a material, if you select it and look in the inspector, you can see at the top we have a tint color here, and if you click on the color swatch, it brings up a color palette. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time dealing with the intricacies of setting color or mapping color, but we're just going to deal with some blocks of simple color here to give ourselves some highlights. I can click and drag a material from my assets folder onto an object, and then I can see it that way. I can also grab a material and drag it onto a shape that actually is up in my hierarchy, and that works as well. Once it's on here, if I decide to come back to the inspector and play with the value, you can see it in real time, which is kind of nice. So I'm just going to leave it this blue that we've got right now. And then I'm going to take the dark gray and drop it onto the capsule, and then set it to a value that makes sense that's actually a dark gray. As far as our emissive material is concerned, I'm going to drop this onto the little tail detail. We can come up here and set the color value and see that in our scene, but that's actually just a color value. It's not emitting light. And you can kind of see that if I turn the light off and on, it's just the surface value of the color. in order to make it emissive, there's another tab below, and you turn it on, and then you click on the HDR. It brings up another color picker. And at this point, if I start mapping color, it's going to look like it's illuminating. In order to get this to physically cast light into our scene, that's another video. But for now, we'll just use it as a way to kind of highlight the object, and it will look a little brighter if the lights are on or off. Okay, so now that I've got my basic little ship module set up, and I can tell the components apart because of some simple materials, we're going to revisit our collider situation. We need to have a way to destroy the ship if it gets impacted and things like that. So we can take this entire ship group at the very top, and we'll add to this a capsule collider. And you can see, if you look real close, that the collider came in as a sphere. And so what I'm going to do is take the height first off and make it longer. I'll set it to 2, and that will be the length that a normal capsule is. And then I'll take the direction of its axis and I'll set it to Z instead of Y, and then it will fit my ship. And if you would like to keep the tail colliders and so forth, you can, but I'm going to simplify mine and just use the body as the main collider for this object. Now, the other thing we're going to need if we want to use physics is, after the capsule collider, we're also going to need a rigid body. So if you search for that and add that component, we'll look at what this does here real quick. Notice if I now hit play in my scene, because I've added this rigid body, the ship's going to fall. It's under the effect of physics, which means gravity is taken over. And I could uncheck gravity, but then if it gets impacted, it might float around weird or do some other things. So what I'm going to do in this case is, I know I want my Y height to stay the same. I'm going to build the entire game at a Y value of 0 just to keep things simple. And since I know I don't want my ship ever deviating above or below that in this case, I'm going to take the constraints in the rigid body and freeze the Y position so that it can't move up or down. That'll allow it to still move left or right and up and down in Z space since we're looking down on it, but it won't allow it to fall. And then the other thing I'm going to do is, I only really want to be able to rotate this ship on Y, just the direction that I want it to look. So I'm going to also freeze the X and the Z rotation values so that it doesn't get skewed in yaw or pitch like this. And you might want that, but in this case I'm going to keep it pretty simple. Okay, we're almost there. We have our mesh set up in some simple objects that are organized in a simple group. We have a weapons group that we'll come back to at another time and put some weapons into. We have a player group that contains everything that has been tagged as player because it has the capsule collider that we'll actually be able to check this tag against. And we've also added a rigid body to it and constrained some of the motion so that we can get predictable motion out here. Okay, I think that's about it for this video. The next video will continue on.